I was reading through this chapter, and it's amazing to me how easy it is to fall back into bad patterns. And I think we notice this. The longer we live, the easier it is. And I was kind of doing some calculations, and since I started pastoring, I think I've lost 800 pounds. Now, I didn't used to weigh, 1,045 pounds, but over the years, I have lost and gained and lost and gained and lost. And so I figured I've lost about 800 pounds. I mean, how many people can say they've lost 800 pounds? Problem is I've gained that back several times, not all at once, but it's pretty difficult. And part of it is my wife is just a really good cook, and so I like to eat. But the other part of it is I lack at times self-control. And there are times, like right now, I feel like I'm doing pretty good. I've been losing, I think I lost 9 pounds in the last couple of weeks, and that's, just pretty good. But there's going to come a point where I'm like, man, I really have been doing good. I should reward myself and just start eating again. And the next thing you know, I'm back up to where I was before. It's just a vicious, crazy cycle. And I think in our Christian life, it's really no different. Following Jesus, sometimes we're full of faith, and sometimes we lack faith. Sometimes we just need, that grace more than ever. In our last chapter, we saw Isaac turning to the Lord when his wife was barren, and she miraculously conceived and bore twins, Esau and Jacob. And remember, she got pregnant, and it was, just the Lord answered, and she got pregnant, and she's like, if the Lord did this, then what is going on? Because inside of her belly, there's just like this. She's just like, there's something wrong. And so she prayed, remember, and the Lord said, there's two nations inside of you. There's the Palestinians and the Israelis. That's basically what was going on. There's Esau and there's Jacob. And they're two nations inside your womb in conflict with each other. And so it's really cool that they could pray and God would speak to them. They could pray and there'd be a miraculous birth. My wife and I know about that. We prayed and very specifically, and the Lord very specifically answered. Is that the sound system or is that something outside? Test it. It's a truck outside, isn't it? Okay, I thought the sound system was going to explode. Anyway, but we prayed and very specifically, at a retreat, the Lord spoke to us through a woman who was there, a pastor's wife who was there, and told us that we were going to have a child. And it was, just completely miraculous. And then a year went by. We waited just like Abraham and Sarah. We waited a whole year. And then at Shannon's pastor's wife's retreat, two ladies spoke to her and told her that, the Lord told them that she was going to have a child very soon. And then, of course, a month later, we conceived. And 9 months later, Isaiah was born. And so we know a little bit about that, and yet what's funny is that can happen, this huge miracle where this miraculous birth takes place one moment, and then the very next moment, how are we going to pay our power bill? It's like God can do this huge thing, but now I have obligations, and how am I going to make ends meet? And yet it's so crazy. Because if God can do something that big, then can He do something that small? And yet it's difficult every time, and that's exactly what we're going to be seeing as we look at Isaac. His wife bears these children miraculously, but then seemingly full of faith, but then a lapse of faith, and falls back into patterns from before. So chapter 26 verse 1, it says, there was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech the king of the Philistines in Gerar. So back in chapter 13, and it could have been as much as 100 years ago, probably not quite that long ago, but a long time ago, when Abraham was much younger, he went through a famine in the land. And now, all these years later, and Isaac would have been, this is right after Abraham's death, so Isaac would have been between 65, as old as 80, but probably not. I'm guessing his wife was a lot younger than him. And Rebekah was probably, he was 40, she was probably 20, maybe in her teens when they married. And so she's much younger than him. But I'm guessing this is right after Abraham dies. All of a sudden, this famine comes, and so he's probably around 65 years old. It doesn't tell us. We have really a wide range of time here that this could have happened. But back in chapter 13, Abraham was in the land, and famine came, and he went down to Egypt. And Isaac, now many years later, experiencing a famine, and he'd never experienced famine in his entire life. You know, he was 40 when his sons were born, and Abraham's died. That would put him at least at 65. His sons are about 15 years old. Abraham's dead now, and he's kind of on his own, make decisions on his own, and this famine comes. And now he has to figure out what to do for himself. And no doubt he heard stories of the famine. It's interesting. You know, we haven't ever experienced, we've experienced recession, you know, in our time. But we haven't experienced depression. We haven't experienced famine. Probably, maybe some of you have, but probably most of us have never experienced a famine. It's interesting when people experience famine, it seems to be something that sticks in their mind. And there was a college professor who was doing a study amongst his students at a Bible college, and they read the story of the prodigal son, and he had them all read the story, and then he had them all retell the story. And in every case of several, I don't know if it was 100 students or what, but of all these students who retold that story, every single one of them left out the fact that there was a famine in the land in the story of the prodigal son. You guys remember that part? Yeah, see, it's not something that really sticks in our mind. And yet, he took the same exercise to Russia and to war-torn areas where there had been famine, people had experienced famine, and that was like one of the main things that they brought out in the stories, that there was a famine in the land, because they remember what a famine was like. So here we have Abraham, who has experienced famine. He knows what famine's all about. He knows what it's like to, okay, there's no food. Our animals are all dying. It's a serious issue. And he's going to pass that story. You know how old people are. They tell you the same story. I was with my grandpa the other day. I mentioned that last week, but I was with my grandpa the other day. He's 87 years old. He kept telling me, I told my wife when I turned 90, I'm going to stop driving. And so I stopped driving. How old am I? She said, 87. Okay, well, I stopped driving when I turned old. You know, whatever. He doesn't even know what age he is, but he knows. He told me that story like 7 times while we were there. He told me other stories, you know, that while we were there several times. And so you know the things that stick out in people's minds are the things that they're going to pass on. And so Abraham's passing on this information about this famine to Isaac. And it becomes very apparent that he did by virtue of the fact that Isaac kind of tries to follow the same pattern. And his desire, Isaac's desire, is to go down to Egypt, because in Egypt there's a fertile delta, the Nile River there, at the end of the Nile River, there's a fertile delta where, you know, just great grassland. And so what he does is he's heading south to the border of the land of Canaan, to a place called Gerar, and this is where a king of the Philistines was living. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, but he was close in Beer-Lahai-Roi, remember, to the border, but now he's right on the border. And we always ask that question, you know, I get that question, especially by young people. How far is too far? You know, I mean, okay, so we don't want to sin, but how close to the edge of sin can I get before I'm actually sinning? You kids ever think that way? Like, what's too, I mean, okay, I'm with my girlfriend, I'm with my boyfriend, how far is too far? Okay, when you ask that question, probably too far. Probably too far already. The reality is we shouldn't be seeking to live on the border or the edge of God's will. We should be seeking to live in the center of God's will, right? You know, now all the old people are like, yeah. And the kids are like, no, I still want to think about that edge, right? Where's that edge? No, we're gonna learn about the edge here, because Isaac in this chapter lives on the edge. And he comes to this guy Abimelech. Now, we've read about Abimelech before. We read about Abimelech in chapter 20. Abimelech was the king of the Philistines. Now, most of the Philistines lived on the island of Crete, but they started to migrate over to the edge. And so this group of Philistines has set camp there, and they're starting to build the kingdom of the Philistines, and so there they are. And this is not the same Abimelech. The word Abimelech, if you remember Melchizedek, that Mel in the Abimelech means king of. And so he is the father king. That's what it means. Abba is father, and Melech is king. And so he's the king father is basically what this means. And so it's a title of their king they call Abimelech. And so Isaac just has this in his mind: if I can get down to Egypt, things will be good. And this seems to imply, and this always is when people start to make decisions, this implies that this famine is affecting Isaac's wealth. And you know how you act when things start to affect your wealth. You know, maybe you thought, man, we're doing good. Have you ever been there? You're looking at your bank account, you know, or you're looking at your piggy bank, depending on your context, and you're looking at the money you have in there, and you're like, I'm doing good. And then, you know, you get that bill. Or, you know, my wife and I did last year. This is what we thought. We thought, man, we're setting good. We're setting good. Our dog is pregnant. She's going to have a load of puppies. You can tell just by how fat she is. She's going to have a load of puppies. We're going to be able to pay off all of our bills. We're going to be, you know, we started, you know, the whole count your chickens before they hatch thing. We were counting all our chickens. We're excited, and things are going to go well. So what happens is, like, right before we go on our mission trip to Rome, this big windstorm knocks half the tree out. Well, not even a quarter of the tree, but it was a huge limb, goes crashing down on my neighbor's house. And then after that, we're thinking, okay, well, we're still okay. We'll sell puppies, then we'll get tax returns. So what ends up happening is our dog has all these puppies. They all die except for 2, and then she dies. And it's just like, what? You know, what's going on? You know, it's just one of those things. Just like everything is going to be wonderful, and then all of a sudden everything goes bad. And that's kind of how Isaac is. He just inherited, his dad died, he inherited everything. He was the heir of everything. All the cattle, all the land, all the people, or not land, I guess they lived in tents, but he had cattle and servants, men servants and maid servants. And now all of a sudden, all of his cattle are dying. And what do? He starts to scramble. You know, what do you do when things go bad? You know, you look at, okay, what can we sell? Okay, who can we call? You know, I got to call my lawyer. I got to call my dad. I got whatever. You know, I need money. And yet, it's rare. I think it's not the natural response, but it should be our first response to do the same thing that Isaac did when his wife couldn't have a baby, which was what? God, help me. You know, help me. My wife is barren. Help me. My cattle are dying. And yet he flips out and starts to head to Egypt, and that's what we see here. It says verse 2. So you can imagine he's on his way. He's got his entourage following him. Then the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land of which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and your seed, all the nations of the earth. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." So God makes this promise to Isaac for the first time. Now, he made this promise to Abraham. And he said, in your seed and in Isaac, your seed shall be called. This is going to be the line that's going to carry out not only a son who's going to be the father of a multitude of people, as the stars of the sea, or the sand of the sea, or the stars in the heavens, for multitude. They're innumerable. But also, through him, and this is key, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Meaning that he is going to be the one who is going to bring about the seed, the male child of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that is going to crush the head of the serpent. It's going to crush Satan's authority. And he is going to bring deliverance, and all the nations of the world through him will be blessed. It's a prophecy about Jesus. that through his descendants, Jesus is going to come into the world, and he's going to deal with the problem of sin, and he's going to make a way for everyone who would trust in him, everyone who would believe in him, to not have to perish in eternal fire, but have everlasting life. This is the promise he's making to Isaac. And that's to blow Isaac's mind, and yet he's saying, I want you to stay put. Don't run down to Egypt. Now we know from the last time, Egypt, and throughout Scripture, Egypt is always a picture of the world. And so that's translated out to our lives. It's, am I going to trust God for what he's promised me in Jesus Christ? Or am I going to run to the world, do what the world wants me to do? And that's really the question that Isaac has to struggle with here. He goes on in verse 5, he says, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments and my statutes and my laws. Now, I want you to notice something here. This is key. Because Abraham obeyed his voice. Notice this. He doesn't say, because Isaac, you are a stud muffin. You got it going on, man. You are the one who makes it happen. You're a righteous dude. He doesn't say that. He says, because of the promises I made to Abraham, and because he did a good job, I'm going to bless you. Does that sound familiar? Because of the promises I gave to Jesus Christ, that he would be the heir of all things, and because he did such a good job, God blesses us. Isn't that awesome? It's the same type of thing. Because Abraham did it, I'm going to bless you. So too for you and for me. God's promises are not based upon your faithfulness, or how good you are, or how well you keep the rules, or how much you love the Lord, or how much you read your Bible, or how much you pray. You can say, I don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls that do. I don't fake it. I don't vape it. I don't do any of that stuff. But it's not based on that, is it? It's based on Jesus Christ and him alone. That's what makes us right before the Father. Nothing else. Nothing else. And so he's saying, just like Abraham, did. Now, what I love about this is Abraham, remember how perfect Abraham was? How he never made any mistakes? Remember how awesome? Wait, he was kind of a bonehead, wasn't he? I mean, the guy, first of all, he slips this one to his wife. Hey, honey, when we get into Egypt, tell him you're my sister. Because you're hot, And I don't want anybody to know you're my wife, otherwise they're going to kill me. And, whatever. You know the story. And so he basically makes his wife she was his half-sister. Well, I know, creepy, right? But she was his half-sister, but she was his wife. And so he should have said, hey, you're my wife. But he says, no, tell him you're my sister. And so they took her into their harem. And then it turns out, it's his wife. And so they, God plagues them. Same thing happens in chapter 20 with Abimelech, probably the great-grandfather of this guy. Hey, tell him you're my sister. He takes her into the harem. Again, plagued. He has to let him go. And so, I forgot what I was talking about. Oh yeah. This is the same thing that Abraham did back in chapter 13, back in chapter 20. And now Isaac, many years later, experienced his famine, and hearing of his father tell this story so many times, he's just like, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make the same dumb decisions that my father has made as I go down. So he says, so Isaac dwelt in the land of Gerar. So still hanging out on the edge. Verse 7. And the men of that place asked about his wife, and he said, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say, she is my wife, because he thought, lest the men of this place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now, she was beautiful to him, but nobody actually took her. And so that kind of tells us something. She wasn't quite as beautiful as Sarah was. Or maybe they just were more cautious because of things that had happened in the past. Now, we knew she was beautiful, but you have to remember when Eliezer went to get her and brought her to Isaac, he was around 40. And he was 40 when his sons were born. Okay? And so she's got to be, she's in her late teens, early 20s. She's still got to be pretty old, right? She's got to be 35, 40 years old. Might be a beautiful woman. But he basically hears the stories that Abraham told, telling the half-truth, and now he just tells a full-blown lie. And it doesn't indicate, however, and this is the difference here, it doesn't indicate that Rebekah was in on it at all. It's like the guys inquired of him, he told them she was his sister. He didn't tell her, hey, tell them you're my sister. So it never indicates that she was in on it. But he found himself in a difficult spot, and so he just lies. You guys ever do that? You find yourself in a difficult spot, and so you just lie about it? No, I didn't eat that. That's funny. I watched this thing where they put these kids, they put this big cake. It was evil. Put this giant cake in front of all these little kids. And they said, okay, don't touch this cake. Don't eat it. Don't touch it. And so they come in and some of the kids have chocolate on their face. And they're like, did you eat the cake? No, I didn't eat it. No. It's hilarious. They just lie because they know they're in trouble. And they were told not to do it, and they still do it. And actually the guy who was interviewing them was like a NSA spy, who was, basically interrogated people, so he knew just by signs. But, they watched a video camera. They watched the kids eat the cake. Only one little girl didn't eat it. One little girl, she said she didn't, but she was like, right on it. She was smelling it, But see, that's just human nature. People lie. Everybody lies. And that's just part of the human condition. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that God likes it. But if you tell me today, I don't lie, guess what? First thing I know, you're a liar. Everybody lies. Everybody tells lies. And some people get so used to lying, and this is the crazy thing. I was like this when I was 18, and it didn't matter. Before I got saved, and even probably for a long time after I got saved, it didn't matter if the truth was more believable. I would just lie because it was just my nature to lie. I just got so used to lying. And I think that sometimes that's just people's default. We want to protect ourselves. Little white lies. It's just so easy to lie. And that's kind of what he does. He, instead of just saying, hey, she's my wife, God's on my side, don't mess with me, he's like, she's my sister. And it's pretty common, and this is the scary thing. I'm going to say something scary for your parents, guys. It's pretty common for kids to repeat their parents' sin. When a parent is seen as dishonest, their kids won't like it, but then oftentimes they end up doing the same thing. I remember stuff. I'm not going to tell. I have 4 parents because my parents got divorced, but I'm not going to tell you who the guilty party was. But one time I remember being told to lie about my age to get into the movie theater, for a little bit, for just a couple dollars less or whatever. I remember that. And you know what? I thought it was wrong at the time, but as I got a little bit older, hey, well, telling little lies like that don't hurt, right? You just kind of get used to that. It's just what people do. If my dad does it, then hey, that's okay. Or if my mom does it, that's okay. It's amazing how many grandparents are very guilty. And they say, okay, well, this is just our little secret. Tell their little 5-year-old granddaughter, it's just our little secret. You don't need to tell mommy and daddy. It's our little secret. It won't hurt anybody. But what happens when that little girl learns that kind of method? Hey, it's just our little secret. It's no big deal. But now she's 15 and her appetites have moved far beyond candy. And she's learned that what mom and dad don't know won't hurt them. Kind of a bad thing to teach a kid, right? Because they move forward, they're not after candy anymore. They're after something else. So, the Bible says this in Exodus chapter 20, I am the Lord your God. I'm a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation. This is key, to those who hate me. But showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. See, Isaac was somebody who loved God. He knew God. We saw that in chapter 25. He prayed to God and his wife conceived. Rebekah prayed to God and she got her answers to why she was having a bellyache. The nations inside of her. And so Isaac isn't under some kind of curse to repeat the sins of his father. And that's the reality. People talk about generational curses. It does not apply to Christians. It applies to those who hate God. That's what it says in Exodus chapter 20. He visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations to those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those who love me and keep my commandments. And so Isaac could have easily been outside of this, not at all destined to repeat his father's sin, but he just found it an easy road to take. And that's what he did. One thing that we have to understand as parents is that our children have to go a lot of times through the same tests that we went through. And that's the hardest thing as parents, isn't it? I mean, don't we try to protect them from the things that we went through so that they won't have to go through them? I mean, and a lot of us, I know some of your stories. A lot of us have done a lot of things that we're not proud of. And yet, we look at our children, we're like, I don't want my kids to have to go through that. I don't want them to have to experience the pain, experience the guilt, experience the shame. And so we do our best to protect them. And yet, oftentimes, a lot of those things that we went through, as bad as they were the things that ultimately brought us to Christ, right? And sometimes that has to happen. The best thing we can do for our kids is to pray for them. To lead them in a godly example, to show them the right way to go. But ultimately, kids are like the Proverbs say, like a quiver of arrows. The best that we can do is aim them, right? Try to point them in the right direction, and then at some point, we have to let go. And sometimes their flights take them on a different direction than we pointed them. But hopefully, as they keep flying, they'll correct and hit the target. And that's all we can aim for. That's all we can pray for. And we have to keep praying for our kids, because every kid has his own personality and his own will and his own, fight against the authority and all that. I mean, it's in every one of us. Our default mode, and this is what's important to understand, is our default mode is the wrong thing. You guys aware of that today? You don't do the right thing by default. You do the wrong thing by default. You do the right thing because you go against your nature to do the right thing. That's the only way we can do the right thing, right? We are born in sin. Sin is what drives us. And a child left to himself brings his mother to shame. And, if we just go with our nature, it leads to very bad things. And so, Isaac just has to go through the same test that his father went through, and God allows this test in his life because he has to show Isaac that he is trustworthy, that he's faithful. Verse 8 says, Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, so he's staying in Gerar, right on the edge for a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. Now, it's interesting, is this word endearment here means to laugh. It's the same word used when Sarah laughed when God says you're going to have a son. But it seems to have more implications. It talks about later on when it talks about the children of Israel sinning against God, making a golden calf, it says they rose up to play. and it uses the same word, and it almost has a sexual idea behind it. The King James Version, I like it, says he was sporting with her. So he looked out his window, he saw them throwing a ball back and forth. No. He saw them doing something intimate that only married folks do in their culture. Verse 9, it says, Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, Quite obviously she is your wife, so how could you say to me she is your sister? And Isaac said to him, Because I said, lest I die on account of her. And Abimelech said, What is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us. Isn't that interesting? Their society, this is a Philistine society, had more moral regard for the sanctity of marriage than our culture does. Isn't that amazing? And yet probably because of what happened in Genesis chapter 20 when Abimelech took Abraham's wife and everybody broke out with the plague. And, it was a bad scene. And so it very likely, just like Abraham passed on the famine story to Isaac, Abimelech's granddad passed on the story of, hey, when you take another man's wife, God brings a plague upon the nation. And so it became a known thing. And yet it's true. When people do things that are morally debased, it brings judgment upon a nation. And you just think about our nation and what we're headed for. It's a scary thing to think about. But they believed that taking another man's wife, even if you didn't know, even if you did it ignorantly, could bring serious ramifications from God. And so he rebukes Isaac. And says verse 11, So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. So he deals with it swiftly because he doesn't want this to turn into something where a plague would come upon their people, and says, don't touch this man or his wife. And it's interesting how God's hands at work using this pagan king, not only to rebuke Isaac, but also to protect him in this nation that he's in. Verse 12, it says, Then Isaac sowed in the land. This is amazing. He sowed in the land, meaning he planted his seed, and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. And so what we have here is a famine. Remember that? A famine in the land. And everybody's hurting. People's animals are dying. Isaac's animals were dying. And now he goes and he sows the seed in the land, and the next thing you know, he reaps 100-fold. Nobody else is reaping. It's pittance. But now he's bringing in a huge crop. It shows God's blessing is upon him. I remember, I just think this is the way that God works in our lives. And so I think as Christians, we have to be aware of this. That God blesses a lot of times in unlikely times. He blesses a lot of times in famine times. He shows himself to be powerful, and he lets us be brought low so that he can display his power in our lives. Now, when we're brought low, a lot of times that's when we freak out, right? Anybody ever freak out? Yeah, we freak out sometimes. But if we trust the Lord, it's the low points, even like this, he's a complete bonehead. All this stuff he's done, but he's at his low point, and God says, don't leave the land. He stays on the edge still, and in spite of all the things he's done, God blesses him. I remember one time when I was traveling with my dad and my stepmom, they're song evangelists, and so we were traveling from church to church all over the United States. And I was a brand new Christian, just, freshly born in the Lord. And I'm kind of watching them as they kind of go through this journey. And we had basically, it was in church every night of the week. Now, I know that sounds horrible for an 18-year-old kid, and I honestly would have never thought, okay, church every night of the week, every day, except for every once in a while, would be a drag, I would think, right? But it wasn't. Talk about just life transforming. I mean, there was no, like we were saying, no place I'd rather be. You know, it was amazing just to be in church every day and how that impacted me. Well, it just started to change my heart, and it was exciting to see God moving in all these places we were going. But then we had this period where my parents had they had these 2 churches that they booked to go to, and this whole month, like an entire month, where we had nowhere to go. And it just happened that way. And they tried everything they could try to get that time booked, but nobody was taken. And so we went to these 2 churches, and they were hoping, and they just came for a love offering. They didn't, beg for money or anything like that, which I really appreciated about them. But they just went, and whatever if the church just wanted to have them come, they could give them an honorarium, or they could just take a love offering. They didn't care. We'll come even if you don't do any of that. That's basically was their deal. And so they came, and the first place we went, the pastor was like Furch on, the Addams Family. Is that what it is? The Addams Family? The guy with the dong, you know what I'm talking about? The old guy. You kids probably don't remember this. Actually, you 30-year-olds probably don't remember this. Anyway, it's this old dude, just really stoic and doesn't talk much. That's kind of how the pastor was. He was just like really, and he was telling us, I don't really think I'm called to be a pastor. So it turned out when we got to his church, it showed, because it was like 3 old ladies. That was it. So we did a concert for 3 old ladies, which was awesome. But, didn't even get any money from, for being there, which was okay. Went to the next church. Looked like there was more happening in church, but it was the same day as a crosstown rival football game. So there was 1 family in the church. Again, blanked out. And my parents, and we had a whole month. We had no money, and we had an entire month to get through. My parents were laying in bed that night together, and they were praying. And they just decided, you know what, we can't do this. Obviously it's not working. And they talked about how they were going to go home and get jobs and start their cleaning company up again. And we're going to figure out a way to get home, and we're just going to make it happen. Well, within the next 48 hours, we ended up being spontaneously invited. This is a really long story, so it would take me the whole time we have to tell you the whole story. But we got spontaneously invited to this sing-a-thon. They put us up for the night. We didn't have any money. They put us up for the night, which had a continental breakfast in the morning. They invited us to come to church and share in the morning. We went to that church and shared in the morning, not expecting it. It wasn't it was in Washington, D.C. They ended up taking a special offering for us, and ended up having, I don't think it was like $700 or something like that, and sent us on our way to this other conference, this booksellers conference, which we weren't getting paid for. There was no, we weren't selling anything there. We were just going there to see if the bookstores would carry my stepmom's tapes. Tapes are these little square things that you used to listen to music on. And we went there, and at that conference, which they were mad at us because we were going to be late, we got there. And the Lord's timing was so perfect that we got there, instead of at the beginning of the sessions, we got there at the end of the sessions. And the things that my parents shared when we got there were so Spirit-filled in terms of what they shared, which completed what the last message was, which we didn't hear, that this guy gets up in front of all these bookstore owners, and he says, there's no way these people could have known what just happened here. He said, I want to hear him sing a few more songs. And so we got up, and we got a standing ovation. We got up and sang a few more songs, and then sat back down. He's like, I just really feel that the Holy Spirit's telling me that we need to take an offering for these people, which has never happened before. So they took a bread basket off the table, emptied the bread out, passed it around, and they took a $2,000 offering for us. And it was enough for us to get through the entire rest of the month, to pay all the house payment, to pay the people that were watching my little brothers back home. And it was just things like that happened again and again and again. But my parents were at their low point. One thing I forgot to mention. They decided to quit, and then the sermon the next morning was how Jesus hung his clothes sign in his carpenter shop and never went back. And when God calls you into the ministry, you're never supposed to turn back, to what you were doing before or whatever. And so it was like they're like, hearing from God, and then God provided all that. It was amazing. And that's the way that God is. Here's Isaac. He's a bonehead. He's like, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go down to Egypt. God says, don't go down to Egypt. He goes, okay, well, I'm going to, lie about stuff. And God exposes him but then he still provides for him. It's such a beautiful thing, hundredfold. Verse 14, for he had possession of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants, so the Philistines envied him. And so blessed, but the people around him saw in their poverty, in their famine, they saw Isaac being blessed. And they envied him. Now the Philistines had stopped up the wells of his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they filled them up with earth. So Isaac goes to drink from the wells of his childhood, and they're all plugged up. This is something I was thinking about. We can't drink from the wells. We can't drink from our parents' relationship with Jesus, can we? We can benefit from that for a time. But if we want to really have a relationship with Jesus, we have to go and dig into God's Word ourselves. We have to dig in to prayer. We have to find God for ourselves. So many of you guys, you teenage guys out here, maybe you're in that place where you're thinking, do I really believe what my parents believe? Just because that's what I was taught. And a lot of kids go through that period in their life where they're like, I need to know God for myself. And so I encourage you, especially you young people, to do that, to say, okay, God, I need to believe you, not because my parents believe in you, but because you're real. And if you're not real, then I'm not going to believe, and I think that's a fair question or a fair thing to say to God. I need to know you for myself, not just because my parents told me I need to believe, my parents told me you're real, but because you are. That's what I want to experience. So encourage you kids not to just say, well, I'm just going to believe it because my parents believe it, because that's not going to hold up when you get to college. You have to experience God for yourself. You have to know God for yourself. You have to dig those wells for yourself. Say, okay, God, you need to reveal yourself to me. I'm going to open your Word. You show yourself to me in a real way so I can have my own relationship with you. And so they get out there. He gets out there, and all the wells that his dad has dug are filled in. And we can't be sustained on yesterday's water either. For those of us who know Jesus, we can't. Just like the manna that was good for the day, and you had to get fresh manna every day. It's the same thing. We can't sustain ourselves on yesterday's water. We have to get fresh water each day. Just like Jesus said in John chapter 4 when he met the woman at the well, he said, if you knew the gift of God, and he who it is that says, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. And the woman said, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where do you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as well as the sons of his sons and his livestock? And Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst again, but the water that I give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. And that's the water that every single one of us needs to go to Jesus, to get living water that never goes away, right? I mean, it's awesome to get wet from the things that our parents taught us when we were kids, but there comes a day when I have to say, okay, Jesus, I need to know you. I need to come to you myself. Do you guys realize that there's no grandchildren in the kingdom of God? You can't be second generation Christian. Every Christian is first generation Christian. Because you're born, and guess what? You are a heathen from the womb. And even though you grew up in a Christian family, that doesn't make you saved. Yeah, see right there, that little one right there. Just because you grew up in a Christian family doesn't make you saved. You have to bow your knee to Jesus. You have to be born again, just like every other person. Verse 16, it says, and Abimelech said to Isaac, go away from us, for you are much mightier than we. And Isaac departed from there, and he pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. And Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up. And after the death of Abraham, he called them by the names which his father had called them. So he goes to this place of dryness, and he redigs the wells that have been long stopped up. Also Isaac, verse 19, servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there, or living water is what the King James says. It just means an artesian well. Kind of funny, I went to McDonald's the other day. I don't recommend McDonald's, but I went to McDonald's the other day and I tried to order an artisan chicken sandwich, and they told me I was getting an artesian chicken sandwich, which I thought was really funny. Anyway, artesian well is a water well that just comes up by itself. It's pressurized under the earth. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So they called the name of the well Esk, or Esk, I don't know, because they quarreled with them. And so this word means quarreled or strife or contention is what it means. Then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So he called the name of it Sitnah, which means opposition. And so we shouldn't find it too surprising when it's time for, we say, okay, I'm going to find God for myself. I'm going to dig my own wells. I'm going to dig into God's word. I'm going to dig into prayer. I'm going to dig into a relationship with God. And we find opposition and strife that come along with that. That's because the enemy does not want us to dig those wells. He does not want us to dig into God's word. He does not want us to dive into a relationship with Jesus. And so he attacks with contention and strife and opposition. Verse 22, he moved from there and dug another well. And they did not quarrel with it, so he called the name of it Rehoboth, because he said, for the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. And so Rehoboth means roominess or space, spaciousness. And God didn't want him to dwell in strife or opposition, and so he makes room for him and his livestock and his people to dwell. And I think that's always true. When we are persistent to seek after God, to dig those wells, to yearn for God, that we will be satisfied. It says he went up from there to Beersheba. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Beersheba is, beer means well. It's not the same as our beer. But beer in Aramaic or Hebrew means well. And Sheba, we'll talk about in a second. So this is the place that Abraham was when he built an altar to the Lord. Abraham had built an altar to the Lord in Beersheba. This was near the place where Abraham was when God met him, and God says, when Abraham was finally in obedience to God, God met him and said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and gave him promises. Remember, Abraham had a hard time getting going too at the beginning. He said, leave your country, your father's house, your family, and go to a place I show you. And so what did he do? He left his country, but he brought his father's house with him and his family. And then his father finally died, and so he left his father behind, but he brought Lot with him, which was his family. And then finally, Lot's herdsmen and Abraham's herdsmen fought each other. And so he's like, okay, Lot, you go whichever way you want to go, I'll go the opposite way. And so Lot was with him, and it was when Lot was gone, all of a sudden, that God says, hey, Abraham. He speaks to him. He's in obedience to God, and then God speaks. But now Isaac's back in the center of God's dwelling place for him, no longer on the edge. And what happens when we're back in the center of God's will? God begins to reveal himself to us again. He begins to speak to us again. And God speaks in verse 24, and the Lord appeared to him the same night and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. So God meets him in his complete yielded obedience. You see, that's the problem with the edge. Because when we say, how far is too far, and we're trying to live on the edge, we have a divided heart, right? And we don't want necessarily exactly all that God wants for us. We kind of want to do our thing, but still want to be on God's side. And yet God says, I want all of it. I want your whole life. I want you to yield everything to me. And that's a tough thing for us, isn't it? I mean, my messed up, wonky life that I've really done a good job at maintaining on my own, I want to keep that. I don't want God's perfect will for my life, which is blessing and the abundant life and In his presence is fullness of joy, and at his right hand pleasures forevermore. And if I delight myself in God, he gives me the desires of his heart. I don't want that. I want my messed up version. Right? That's where we are. We're always trying to live on the edge. Like, I got something figured out better than what God has. I can do it. Don't bother me, God, because I'm over here. I'm still in your will. Look, it's right on the edge. This is your will. That's my will. And see, I'm still in your will mostly. That's how we are. We want to skirt the edge of God's will. And yet when we find ourselves in the middle of God's will, that's when God comes to us and says, this is what I want to do with your life. And guess what? It's always going to be better than what you ever thought your life was going to be. It's always going to be better. And it may be difficult at times, but the whole time it's difficult, you'll be like, man, I can't even imagine, even with all the difficulty, I can't even imagine going back to what I used to be. Even though things didn't go the direction I thought they were going to go, I can't imagine ever abandoning what God is doing in my life right now, even with the tribulation, even with the difficulty. And guess when that moment of complete obedience is going to mean the most to you? What do you think that will mean to you in eternity? When you're standing in the presence of God and you can look back on your life and say, you know what, I'm so glad that I was in the center of God's will and that I didn't run off and do my own thing. It's going to mean something to you forever. And so he appears to him again, same night. I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you and multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. And this is what God is saying to you. I am going to do marvelous things through your life for my son Jesus' sake. Because I want to glorify him. And I want to use you to do it. So he built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord and pitched his tent there. And there servants dug a well. So, he built an altar, same place his father built an altar. And Abraham was the man of the altar, wasn't he? Every time he went somewhere, he built an altar. Isaac was the man of the well. Everywhere he went, he dug a well. Jacob will be the man of the tent. He always pitching his tent. It says, then Abimelech came from Gerar with Ahazath, one of the friends of Phicol, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, why have you come to me since you hate me and have sent me away from you? So these are the guys who say, get out of here. He's like, why are you coming to me now? But they said, we have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. And so this is very similar to what happened to Abraham. They came to Abraham. They said, let's make a covenant. God's obviously blessing you. Let's make a covenant. And so they did. And you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now blessed of the Lord. So we made them a feast and ate and drank. And they arose early in the morning and swore an oath to one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So God has blessed him, even though his enemies are around him. God has protected him because Abimelech has said no one can touch him, and then he was able to bless him financially. Could you imagine what would have happened if Isaac would have gone into the land, made a bunch of money, and he didn't have that protection? They'd have just taken his stuff, probably. It came to pass, verse 32, the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. So he called it Sheba. This word means seventh. Therefore, the name of the city is Beersheba to this day. And so basically he names it seventh well. But that's significant. It's the number of completion. It's the place where he's supposed to be. The seventh well ends up being the one that God would bless. And I think it's often true in our lives. As we continue to seek the Lord and seek the Lord and seek the Lord. And sometimes, and I hear people say this all the time, I pray and I don't feel like God hears me. Don't stop digging. Don't stop seeking. If you seek, you will find. If you seek with all your heart. I think it's interesting that the number 7 is the number of completion. It's like a complete seeking of the right place, the right water, the right well. And so he calls the place Beersheba. And then verse 34 kind of switches gears, and I believe that this is probably a little bit later. It doesn't tell us. The timelines, as we've seen, especially last chapter, are really ambiguous. We don't know exactly when all these things take place. This doesn't mean this happened directly afterwards, but it says when Esau, so later, when Esau was 40, he took wives, Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. And so Esau, just to revisit Esau, remember Esau was the guy who was the oldest of the two, Esau and Jacob. We saw this in chapter 25. And Esau was a hairy man. That's what Esau means, is hairy. He was red and hairy. And Jacob was a plain man or smooth man, or the Hebrew is actually perfect man, whatever that means. But Jacob liked to hunt in the field, and Esau lived in the tent. He liked to sit in and play his Game Boy or something in there, rather than go out in the field. More of a video game guy. I don't know. Anyway, but Esau despised his birthright. Now, what that means is that he despised the fact that he was the oldest, which meant that he was the one who was going to be the one who was blessed, and that all the nations of the world would be blessed through him. And so what we learn about Esau is that he despised that the Messiah was going to come through him. He didn't care about it. He didn't give a rip that Jesus was supposed to be born through his line. And so when Jacob, who wanted it, he wanted that in his life. He's like, man, the Messiah to come through me, yeah, that would be awesome. When Esau comes in, he's all hangry. You ever been hangry? He's totally hangry. He comes in, he's like, I want something to eat. Give me some of your stew to Jacob. And Jacob's like, okay, I'll give you some stew if you sell me your birthright. And he's like, what good is it to me if I'm dead? And he said, okay, eat up. And they called him Edom because of that. So Edom means red. You eat red stew. And he sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of soup. Now this is what the book of Hebrews says about him. If you want to turn there with me, we're going to end with this. Verse 12, or chapter 12 of Hebrews. Verse 14 through 17. And I want you to notice what this says here. This is very important. It ended there in Genesis 26:35 that he was a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah because he'd taken these daughters of the Philistines, or of the Canaanites rather. And it says in verse 14 of chapter 12 of Hebrews, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Look carefully, or be careful, lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by this many become defiled. So Esau, he has kind of a root of bitterness, doesn't want his birthright, sells it to his brother. But notice what it says here, verse 16. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright. For you know that afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought it diligently with tears. And we're going to see that in the next chapter, where Jacob steals his blessing. Not only did he steal his birthright, but he steals his blessing. But he's saying, this Esau, he was a profane man, and he was a fornicator. He was profane, and he would sell his right to be the heir to the Messiah for a bowl of soup. He was just all about his flesh. This is amazing. How many people, and I've seen this as a pastor, I see this all the time, how many people, for one moment of pleasure, for one glimpse of something that is forbidden, will lose everything. It is amazing to me. And when we live by the flesh, we will die by the flesh. But if we walk in the Spirit, we'll walk in life. And Esau was definitely not that. He was all about the flesh. That's why God said, and this is a really difficult passage, it says it in Romans chapter 9, but it also says it in Malachi, Jacob I have loved, and Esau I have hated. Now, what is it that he loved about Jacob? What is it that he hated about Esau? Now, I submit to you, it's not that he hated Esau as a person, or that he even loved Jacob as a person necessarily. He loved both of them. But he hated what Esau represented. And what was that? It was unbelief. If I don't believe in God, I'm willing to do anything. I'm willing to do anything to satisfy my flesh at any time. If I don't believe in God, if I don't really believe that God is there, that He is to be feared, that He is holy, and that He is just, and that if I seek His face, He will bless me, and if I find myself outside of His will, His wrath rests upon me, if I don't believe that, if I am an unbeliever and just living for the flesh, God hates that. God hates unbelief. And yet, what does He love? He loves belief. He loves those who put their trust in Him and say, God, you know what? It looks like my way is going to be better just because I'm fleshy. But I believe that what you have for me is better than what I have for myself. And when we give up our own will and say, God, I want your will instead of my own will, He takes our life and gives it to us. But those who seek their life will lose it. And those who those who lose their life for Christ's sake will find it. And that's the difference between Jacob and Esau. Esau, profane. Jacob, again, another bonehead. It's like a family of boneheads. He's going to make a lot of dumb mistakes, but he believed God. And because he believed God, God blessed him. You see, that's the thing, guys, is you will never be perfect. I just want you to realize that right now. You're never going to be perfect. You're never going to overcome all of your sin in your life. You're never going to be like, you're never going to wake up one day and say, I'm perfect now. I'll never make a mistake again. I'll never think a bad thought. I'll never do a bad thing. I'm just perfect now. Never going to happen in this side of glory. Once we see Jesus, we're going to be able to say that. But right now, you're going to be messed up until the day you die. You are going to need Jesus until your dying breath. I guarantee you that. Don't let anybody deceive you. You are going to need Jesus until your dying breath. And the more you give into your lusts and your flesh, the more pain your life is going to be. And the more you submit to Him, the more exciting, the more fulfilling, the more enjoyable your life will be. So it's your choice. It's like God told the children of Israel, I set before you now life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life that you and your descendants might live. And for us, that life is Jesus Christ. And that's the only life there is. Let's pray.